Good afternoon, NDC. How are you all doing? Hello. 2019 marks a historic anniversary in the endeavors of human engineering. 50 years ago, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first human beings ever to walk on another world. And as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the moon landings and the culmination of the Apollo program, we thought this would be a good opportunity to look back at some of the techniques and processes that were developed as part of that program. Small steps, giant leaps, engineering lessons from Apollo. Now, I kind of first had this idea. What we are not going to do today is tell you how the software that flew to the moon actually worked. There is a couple of good reasons. One, it ran on a 2.0 megahertz processor with 32 words of 15-bit memory, plus 1 bit for parity, because you have problems in space with radiation and stuff. The source code for Apollo 11, the spacecraft that flew to the moon, is actually on GitHub. You can go up there and you can read it. One of NASA's interns scanned it all in a couple of years ago. They put it online. There's a couple of very good pull requests if you fancy a laugh. There's one which is a change to the mission profile to go and rescue Matt Damon from Mars. There is one which is, it was actually quite sort of subtle. Someone made a change to one of the configuration timing files, and it took a couple of days before they realized that they'd fixed the thing that crippled Apollo 13 in a pull request 48 years too late. So, you know, software engineering deadlines, you got this. But a few years ago, I had the great pleasure of going to the Science Museum here in London to watch these two gentlemen, Brian Cox and Colonel Buzz Aldrin, talking about space travel. And it was a really brilliant session. Buzz Aldrin is in his 80s now, and he's still working full-time on, you know, human crewed spaceflight. And something that kind of came across really strongly in his conversation as part of this interview, and a lot of the work he does, is a sense of frustration that we were better at this in the 1960s than we are now. And to some extent, he's right. You know, in the 1970s, if the United States of America wanted to fly to space, they put one of their space rockets there, fueled it up, and went. And now, if the United States wants to go into space, they have to get a lift with the Russians or ask Elon Musk for a favor. They are working on it, I understand. But, you know, this sort of started me thinking, I wonder how much of the stuff, the techniques and processes and technology that was developed for the Apollo moon landings and, you know, like Buzz Aldrin's mission here, I wonder how much of that is still relevant. And I wonder if there's really stuff in there that we used to be good at that we have forgotten. So I started putting together this idea for a kind of 50th anniversary of the moon landings talk. And then I was at Build Stuff in Lithuania last year. I was looking down the program, and I saw 1968, a talk by Kevlin Henney, and I thought, bugger, Kevlin has beaten me to it. He has nicked my idea. So I went along to Kevlin's talk, and it was brilliant, and it was all about stuff we got right in the 1960s that a lot of companies and organizations are still struggling with today. And to my great relief, it was not about space travel. But I happen to know that Kevlin is a huge space nerd, just like me. And so I was trying to go after it. I said, look, I got this idea for a thing I want to do next year. Would you be interested in collaborating, doing it together? And he said yes. So please give a big hand of welcome to the stage, Kevlin Henney.
I'd just like to blame the Lithuanian beer.
It accepts full responsibility.
Excellent. Good, right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to do a launch countdown. We are going to share with you 10 lessons
11.
From 11.
11. The dial goes all the way up to 11.
The dial goes up to 11. This is the Spinal Tap mission profile. We have 11 lessons from, or 11 observations from the Apollo moon landings and the sort of, you know, the pioneering period in manned space aviation. Starting with number 10, strategy, vision, and roadmap. Now, at the beginning of the 1960s, right, America was in a bit of a pickle. It was,
in a bit of a pickle, but not in orbit.
World War II had ended, But the Cold War was kind of, very much underway. There was this war of kind of minds and propaganda and things going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in 1958, the Soviet Union had shocked the entire world by launching this, Sputnik 1, the first ever artificial satellite. And this was, few people realized they were even close to being able to do this. And in terms of the impact that this had on the world, people in the United States could go outside with a shortwave radio, just in their backyard, and they could hear a Russian satellite flying over the mainland US. There was a journalist at the site who said, it doesn't matter whether you believe it or not, you can go in your backyard at sunset and look at it. And this scared a lot of people. It caused a lot of, sort of very complicated political maneuvering, and how was the US going to respond to this? And their first satellite launch wasn't much of a success, was it?
No. There's lots of really good footage of exploding rockets. A lot of the exploding rocket stuff that you get, black and white footage, that's kind of these early launches, and particularly the first one.
There's a lovely Kaputnik.
Kaputnik
is what the press dubbed the first American attempt to put a satellite in orbit. But they did eventually succeed. They got Explorer 1 in orbit a few months after this. And then the Soviets scored another first with Yuri Gagarin, the first human being to go into space.
12th of April, 1961, which for the date watchers, 12th of April, 1981 was the first launch of the space shuttle, if you're trying to get a sense of how much you can do in 20 years. Yeah. But yeah, he went into orbit, and that was that.
I love the fact they commemorate Gagarin. Everyone else gets, Columbus Day and Martin Luther King Day. He gets Yuri's Night, because you commemorate Gagarin's flight by going outside at night and looking up at the stars, which I think is quite cool. And again, the United States followed suit, but there was very much this perception that they were playing catch-up. They were getting left behind in the space race. Now, we're here to talk today about the engineering behind the moon landings, but it's important to understand the fundamental objective of any engineering project. Somewhere, somebody will have something that they are trying to do, something they are trying to achieve. The US did not. President Kennedy and his advisors, they didn't care about the moon. There's nothing on the moon that they particularly wanted. They needed a way of scoring points in this propaganda war. And this is a memorandum from 1961 sent from President Kennedy to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, where he literally says, do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space? Or by a trip around the moon, or by a rocket to land on the moon, or a rocket to go to the moon and back with a man? Is there any other space program which promises dramatic results which we could win?
So this is just over a week after Gagarin goes into orbit. And so this is the kind of response time of, but look at the ambition. It's already laid out. We don't know what, but we need something, and it's got moon, it's got laboratory, it's got the works, okay? So in other words, they weren't just thinking of, should we just put a couple of people in orbit and do something clever with them there? So no, the moon was genuinely, outrageously a possibility.
Yeah. And the thing that I think is interesting about this, there's okay, here is our objective. This is something I think about as the what and the how. What do we need to do? Impress the Soviets, impress the world. How? We got a bunch of options. Let's pick one. When you pick one, that becomes the what. The decision is made. And then leadership and management is how do you communicate that decision?
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
I just want to take a moment to pick apart this quote, because this is one of the sort of great historic speeches of the last century. I believe that this nation should commit itself. This is not a mission being assigned to somebody else, some organization. This is the President of the United States saying, this nation should commit itself. We are all in this together, to achieving the goal before this decade is out. Now it sounds good, doesn't it? It's like good thumping rhetoric. At this point, the United States, they'd had what, 15 minutes?
15 minutes.
In space, total.
That was
They sent someone up above Florida, and he's splashed back into the sea. They had no idea how to get to the moon.
That's Alan Shepard. That was it. You're going to go from 15 minutes to the moon, and you're going to go and ask for money, but look at the framing of this.
Now, the CIA believed that the Russians, the Soviet Union, would not be able to land on the moon before 1970. So this kind of classic quote is actually a really calculated estimate. This is, we need as much time as we've got, as much time as we can possibly buy ourselves to do this, but if we take too long, the whole thing is pointless because they're going to get there first. Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Now, there was talk at the time, why don't we send someone on a one-way trip? And a lot of the early astronauts, you know, these were military test pilots who had served in World War II, served in Korea. They were absolutely used to the idea that people died in the service of their country. By putting this in a thing, that was taken off the table. President Kennedy is like, no, you know, this is the equivalent of one of your engineering managers standing up and saying, look, we need to make money. We are not going to sell our customer data. Stop talking about that. That is not an option here in how we are trying to solve this problem. And that was it. You know, the vision was stated. Now, there is some language here that I want to pick up on and dig into a little bit, because you see the word man come up an awful lot. We talk about manned spaceflight landing, a man on the moon, one small step for a man. There is a certain kind of school of commentary which says, oh, that's just how people talked in the 1960s. That was inclusive language. I'm calling bullshit on that, because if America really wanted to put human beings on the moon, there are quite a lot of human beings who consume less than men in terms of the amount of food and water and oxygen that is required to keep them alive for the duration of the mission. On average, they tend to weigh less. They're known as women. If America really wanted to get to the moon first, they would have sent a female crew on Apollo. But they didn't. There was, you know, there was some consideration.
There was consideration. So in other words, this is not just retrospective. At the time, there was discussion, genuine, proper consideration, parallel programs. This was all explored, considered, but the patriarchy is what it is.
And so anyone says it's institutionalized language, nah, it's not. Institutionalized sexism is what it was. But you know, this was a long time ago. But I wanted to pick that up. We are going to be using manned a lot because that's what's in all the quotes we're discussing and the documents and so on. We wanted to put some context around it. Now, when somebody on one of your teams communicates a big decision, it takes a little while, and then people start going, we're not sure about this. This is expensive. This doesn't make sense. We don't like it. We should have used MongoDB. Leadership is often as much about following through. It's not just making the decision, it is being prepared to reinforce, to defend that decision. 18 months later, Congress are starting to complain about how much money is being spent on the moon program. They have kind of no return on that investment yet. And Kennedy is at Rice University. He makes this historic speech.
The most
There
famous.
is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
So just in case you'd forgotten what a president can sound like.
Now, as you know, Kennedy did not live to see his vision fulfilled. He was assassinated at, 18 months after that? Dallas, Texas, November 1963. But that vision, you know, at its peak, the Apollo moon program employed something like 500,000 people, and every single one of them knew that speech. There's a story about Lyndon Johnson, who became president after Kennedy's assassination, going to visit a NASA facility, and there's just a guy mopping the floor. And he goes over and he says, hey, you know, what are you doing? And this janitor looks up from his mop and he says, Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon. And, you know, you think about that level of alignment behind the goal of your organization. How many people are on your teams and in the sort of companies you work with? Could you go and say, what are you working on? And straight away, they're like, we're trying to do this. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're working towards. We're all going to know when we've done it. And on that day, every single one of us is going to feel like we were part of this accomplishment. We were part of this victory. Which leads us nicely into...
You've got to get the right people. Now, it's quite... Initially, it's obvious that you think of the astronauts. You think of the right stuff. And a lot of people think that it is just simply that they were accomplished flight jocks with square jaws. There's a little bit more than that. They certainly fitted a certain photo profile, but they were not necessarily beautiful. But what was interesting is when you look at them, they had a particular passion. Neil Armstrong had wanted to do this kind of thing since he was small. They all wanted to go to space. They were
Armstrong, yeah, he had a pilot's license before he had a driver's license.
Yeah.
He passed his pilot's license on his 16th birthday with money he saved working in a drugstore. You know, so
there is a dedication here. We have, and they weren't simply just flyboys. To this day, NASA is still using techniques that Buzz Aldrin worked on in his doctorate in 1963 about, honestly, how do you dock craft in orbit? Orbital alignment, visual alignment, everything, this was all explored. So he got his doctorate for that. So
anyone in here played Kerbal Space Program? Yeah, you know how difficult it is. Yeah, Aldrin wrote his doctorate thesis in 1963 on how to win Kerbal Space Program. Yeah, basically.
So, you know, he's got the job. And so you already discover that the people who are actually going to be on the mission are already overqualified in one sense, but it goes all the way down. This is Gene Kranz in the center. And if you watched Apollo 13, he plays a fairly key role there. Gets a new waistcoat for every mission. In high school, he had written his thesis on interplanetary travel. You know, this goes all the way back. This is not just a recruitment. What would you like to do? I don't know. I've just been working for some company, and this looked like a good opportunity to change career. No, it's just like there's a dedication, there's a focus. It goes all the way down. So you're looking for geeks. You're looking for the right kind of geek. And let's have a look at some 1960s geeks.
So this illustrates the diversity of NASA in the 1960s. This gentleman here is smoking a pipe. The rest of them are smoking cigarettes.
That's
this was a diverse workforce.
Yeah. But they're all wearing the standard uniform, which is the white shirt with the pens. Okay, so you knew that these people could be trusted. But there is a notion here, and I think it's very easy to forget when you're looking back. You go, oh, we've got much better computers and all the rest of it. But computers only allow you to do something faster and more easily. You have to have something else there, the people thing, that kind of focus, and that is the right people thing. If you have, it doesn't matter what your compiler's doing, it doesn't mean you're going to get good code. It doesn't matter if you come to NDC and you go to a talk and you say, I'm going to take back all of the buzzwords, unless people are kind of like, yeah, this is how we do it. We're going to invest in this, and we're going to learn how to do it and work together on this. Now, there is a little bit, it wasn't just Bose. History is not very good at recording this, but yes, there were women mathematicians. We're almost in the classic computer era in the sense that women were the people who actually computed all of this stuff. We're just a little bit after the Hidden Figures era. If you've not seen Hidden Figures, that's definitely worth watching. But there is this notion that you have 400,000 people, and there is a pyramid here, but everybody fits all the way down to the janitor. And there is a certain passion and dedication there.
One of the interesting things they did is they would send the astronauts on tours of the workplaces. So they'd go to like a rubber factory in Delaware, and one of these people who they'd seen on TV, they'd seen on Life magazine, would basically stand up and say, do good work or we're going to die. And all these people would go back to work on a production line, gluing rubber seals for helmet collars and things, thinking, if we do our job right, that man's going to land on the moon, and if we do our job wrong, he's going to die, and it might be our fault. It was an incredibly effective way of kind of mobilizing the right people and getting them all aligned behind these kinds of objectives.
But we're not suggesting that you go and motivate people through threat of death or anything like that. Okay, it's just understanding that with respect to this project, that was the appropriate alignment.
Take any opportunity you can to remind people why what you're doing matters. talk about rockets.
Yeah. So, you know, we're going to consider approaches and make decisions. What you see there is the classic Tintin. In fact, well, this is taken from Tintin. But this is the classic rocket. This is what people recognize as a rocket. And this is the rocket of the 1950s, the 1960s. And honestly, even after Apollo landed, this is still people's kind of default mental model. Now, there's an interesting thing here, is that this is quite large. It flies from the Earth all the way to the moon and then comes all the way back. Turns out that takes quite a lot of fuel. And it turns out on the pages of a comic book, that doesn't really matter. And with the special effects of the time, you can make a film and it doesn't really matter.
So we mentioned earlier this idea, we need to impress the world, beat the Russians. How? This way, this way, this way, this way. Pick that one, go with it. Once they decided to go to the moon, how? There were a bunch of options on the table. These were basically the high-level mission profiles they could have flown. Now, Tintin's rocket there is what is known as a direct ascent. Take a great big rocket, launch it off the Earth, fly it to the moon, land it on the moon, launch it off the moon, fly it back to the Earth, and land it again. The two alternatives that were being considered and developed were something called the Earth Orbit Rendezvous. You launch a bunch of components into orbit around the Earth, you stick them together, and then you fly that to the moon and land it. And the third one, this was a real outsider, wasn't it? Like, no one took this seriously at first, was a thing called the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, where you park one ship in orbit around the moon, and you send the other piece down, and they walk around on the moon, then they come back and they dock, and you bring the whole thing back to Earth again. And we got a sort of illustration from some blueprints of the time of this is the size of the thing that would have had to land on the moon and come make it back to the Earth. So, and the one on the left, the bit on the top looks familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, if you're looking at that going like, wait a minute, I've seen those before. So in other words, there were parts of the design that were already kind of settled, but what you've now got is this effective support system for taking the Earth return vehicle all the way down to the surface. You're not going to use it, and then taking it all the way back up again and all the way back to Earth. Alternatively, the lunar orbit approach is just send down a lander. We specialize different stages of the journey. And in fact, what they ended up with was effectively a hybrid of an Earth orbit rendezvous and the lunar orbit rendezvous. In the Earth orbit one, in fact, if you watch, we'll be referring to Apollo 13, the film later. If you watch, there's this notion there, the term lunar injection orbit, there's all of this kind of stuff. They orbited the Earth. Are we good? Are we good? Yes, we're good. Right, we're ready to go. And so in other words, each stage of the mission is carried out. It has its own, as it were, it's a submission, and you can actually explore it quite nicely, quite tidily. And it turns out that indirection is helpful. It also helped the engineering side of things, as we can see here.
So one of the disadvantages of the direct ascent approach, as we've already mentioned, you have to carry everything with you. The fuel that you are not going to need until you get back to the Earth and you're decelerating to come and splash down. You need to carry that fuel all the way to the moon and all the way back, with all of the logistics and complexity that entails. Now, how many of you have ever kicked off a software project by doing npm install, and suddenly you have 200 modules that you're not going to need until you actually go live 6 months later? Or, you do kind of like a big design up front, and you just end up on the way you're developing software with this friction. You're carrying this enormous amount of complexity, production databases, deployment processes, encryption keys, which are not helping you get where you need to go, and you're not going to need them right until the very end. Basically, you want to take some lessons from the mission profiles about how to build software. When you install packages, imagine that they're made of thousands of tons of explosive rocket fuel. And ask yourself, do you want to be carrying that with you every time you try and do anything? Because the more, whether it's physical mass on a spacecraft or it's just complexity of any kind of engineering project, the more complexity you're carrying with you, the harder it is to change your mind about what you're going to do next. The harder it is to pivot and to change direction.
And that's that reduction of complexity that is really important here, because what you're seeing is, again, it's that big upfront design thing where you can end up carrying literally this design weight all the way through. Let us design for all of the requirements that we imagine at this point, but we haven't delivered anything. And there is that notion of like, no, let us separate this mission into different parts. This mission profile has different stages, different stories are going to be told. We can isolate each one of these, explore it, and it carries no more weight than necessary. There is a conceptual elegance to that. And there's also this kind of thing about try a couple of things out in practice. Found this wonderful one. What would the consequence of the direct ascent approach be? Well, it means that the actual astronaut compartment is way, way off the ground. And when you first look at this, it looks like this guy's just hanging on for dear life, hanging out what is actually looks like a Gemini capsule. It's just hanging on. Then you look closer and you realise there's little footholds. This is a really awkward way. You are going to land on another world, and the first thing you've got to do is climb down an insane climb. If you're a climber, then this is okay. You're thinking that's quite an interesting challenge. But you're wearing a spacesuit, and you've now got to get down to the surface via, well, this is multiple stories. So there are issues with this design.
Not least of which is, now I look at it closely, there's no way for them to get back up. That whole returning them safely to the Earth bit kind of falls down a little bit.
It fell down the last step. We didn't practice this,
So instead,
they ended up with this. And you can see the ladder on the right-hand side there. And again, there's another modularity aspect here, is that the return part is the upper stage. So that even this is in 2 stages. And they have, the material here is incredibly fragile. It's not much better than aluminium foil. This thing is definitely not designed for the turbulence of Earth re-entry. So this is a very delicate thing. It was designed for a purpose. And again, there's a modularity lesson here as well. Something else they discovered is that you can source this out to different people. And we'll be coming back to the consequences of that one later.
So, counting down, 7.
So, work towards significant milestone. That's a Gemini capsule. That is, so the programs, the US programs, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. Mercury, 1 astronaut. Gemini, 2 astronauts. Looks a bit like a Mercury capsule, just a little bit larger. Apollo, 3 astronauts. But what was interesting is going back to Kennedy's speech and this question of feasibility. How are you going to do this thing that nobody has ever done before? Well, it turns out that it's made up of lots of different things that people have never done before.
To boldly go where no one has gone before, quite literally.
Quite literally. And so there's all of this stuff. And it turns out what they did is they broke down the objectives. Each mission was basically designed to demonstrate something in hardware, in software, in human terms, or in terms of the actual structure of how are we going to get this stuff done. And a very simple one, a very simple example is we've never sent 2 people into orbit. Okay, brilliant. That's the first thing. And what about docking? Turns out that's quite a big deal. If you plan to dock in orbit, first of all around the Earth, and then again around the Moon, it turns out you need to know how to dock. You can't just leave that one. You need to practice this. You need to find out how that works. And this didn't go quite as well as planned initially, and Neil Armstrong was the survivor. He managed to survive that mission, but docking with an Athena module, that turned out to be more exciting than was expected. But this is why you do it. Each thing, how do you go outside a spacecraft? That was Ed White. How do you do all of these things? Every single one. And the whole of the Apollo program was structured like that. Yeah. It was every
There's actually
single
a really weird quirk. So the Gemini program, every one of them. So Gemini 1 was the first to put 2 people into orbit. Gemini 2 was the first mission to use a hydrogen fuel cell. Gemini 3, 4, 5. Gemini 7 launched before Gemini 6 because Gemini 6 was going to test rendezvous, and it didn't have anything to rendezvous with, so they had to launch Gemini 7 first so that 6 could go up and dock with it.
Yeah, so it's not just Star Wars films that are out of sequence. But this is important, and importantly, that was a rendezvous of 2 manned spacecraft. They'd already tried docking as well. So in other words, they're not coming to each one of they're upping it, because that's the other thing is when they rendezvous from the lunar return, from the lunar surface, you have humans in one craft, you have humans in the other craft. So every single thing is like, can we figure this one out? Can we do this?
And the point is, when they figured it out, they did it. They shipped it. Every single one of these missions was like, we've tested it in a lab. We talk more about simulation testing in a minute. They did it. They put real people in space doing real mission profiles to prove this stuff was actually going to work. 6.
So, this is, it turns out, and you might be familiar with the idea of names being hard, but it also matters. Naming things matters, all the way down to NASA, which had a very unsexy name in the 1950s, but you can imagine if you left it to most government organisations, you'd end up with a very dull name and a very dull logo. This is actually quite dynamic. But on the right, you see the patch for Apollo 11. And you have the image of the eagle. The eagle was the call sign that Aldrin and Armstrong used. And this whole idea of the call signs being used was really quite important. And we can actually see there's a couple of things here. One is there's a sort of an emotional aspect to the name. There's a personal connection. There you have the name Apollo, which is far more evocative. You're tapping into Greek mythology there. We compare that with some of the names they've got now, like ISS and SLS and stuff like that. So these names are the things that people remember. Okay, so let's talk about something that you won't remember. 196905C has landed. Does anyone remember that one, that famous quote? No, that's the official designation of that vehicle. In fact, if you go to the NASA page, that's, if you look at the URL, that's the URL. We could go a little bit further and get a little bit more of a name. Apollo 11 LMEASEP has landed. So the /LM lunar module, EASEP, that's the experimental package. It was the early prototype of the experimental package, the kind of grid of stuff that is on the moon. Again, that's an official designation. And then you get this, and you think, yeah, history remembers this one. Right from Tranquility Base. Tranquility Base was something that Aldrin and Armstrong made up. The first time anybody ever heard it was when they said it here, except for Charlie Duke, who was CAPCOM, we'll talk about CAPCOM later, who was briefed by Aldrin and Armstrong, we're going to call it Tranquility Base, just so you're not phased when we say it. Okay? So you're primed, the eagle has landed. So you've got all of this, you've got this language here, and this shows a connection for the people who are doing the work to their work. These are not simple numbers. But these are also things from the public perception. You can remember them. There's something joyful about these names.
One of the great things about the names is that it was the crews who actually flew on the ships who got to choose the names for them, kind of up to a point. So Apollo 8 was, when it arrived, when the command module arrived from, it was Rockwell Engineering, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Rockwell.
It was wrapped in blue polythene, and it looked like a giant boiled sweet, so they called it Gumdrop. And then the lunar module was called Spider. It was going to be called Spider. It didn't actually fly. So Gumdrop and Spider were the call signs for that one. And then the one after that, all the astronauts wore these little kind of cloth caps with little black earpieces, which is where they had their communications gear that made them look like Snoopy. And so they adopted Snoopy and Charlie Brown as the kind of unofficial mascots of the Apollo program. And Apollo 10, which was the one that nearly landed, or it was a full dress rehearsal, was called, the command module was Charlie Brown and the lunar module was Snoopy. And if they'd landed, it would have been Houston, Tranquility Base here, Snoopy has landed. On the moon, one small step for a beagle, one giant. At which point NASA was like, you can still pick the names, but please pick slightly better sounding names. But that led to the sense of this is our mission, we get to choose it. Even the mission patches, we got the, backtrack a couple of slides.
Yeah.
So the Apollo 11 mission patch, which is the American eagle with the olive branch of peace landing on the moon with the Earth in the background, it was designed by Neil Armstrong. It wasn't some art department. The crews designed their own mission insignia, their own call signs. And that, when you trust the engineers to be like, look, you're working on this thing, what do you want to call it? What name makes sense for your project that's going to give you that sense of ownership and investment in the way that you relate to the machines and the systems that you're building? It can make a massive difference that costs, almost nothing. 5? Are we on 5?
I think we're on 5.
5.
Ah, yes. So we're going to take a systems view. And this is Margaret Hamilton. She headed up the team at MIT that developed the Apollo guidance computer, the software for the Apollo guidance computer. And that software ran on both the command module and on the lunar module. As Dylan mentioned earlier on, the constraints on memory were quite ridiculous. But she was also the person that coined the term software engineering. But the most famous picture of her...
We have a picture of the code here.
We have a picture of the code. There she is next to the code. But she is also immortalized. By the way, who has the Lego Women of NASA? Oh, come on, people, you can do better than that. We have 2 in our house. So she's one of the Women of NASA immortalized. But notice the fidelity of this, as was observed just while we were preparing the talk. They even kept the hat stand in.
They've got the hat stand, they've got the same code written up on the blackboard, and they've got this stack of folders, which is all the... So that the GitHub slide I showed you at the beginning, these are the folders which were scanned in and then corrected by hand to put that repository up on GitHub. That's how much code they had to put in to share that repo. It's what it looked like hard copy. And they didn't have a compiler. Most of this was compiled.
It was hand compiled. If you've ever wondered about that, so hand compiled, you're thinking incrementally compiled. So they did it. Hand compiled is exactly as it sounds. Artisanal code.
Yeah. Weaving ones and zeros onto little ferrite core memory rings with copper wire by hand. And doing it just right, otherwise the nice man who came to the factory last week might die and it'll be your fault. Well, let's talk about this quote.
So here's this thing. Margaret Hamilton invented the term software engineering. She, as she says here, I began to use the term software engineering to distinguish it from hardware and other kinds of engineering, yet treat each type of engineering as part of the overall systems engineering process. What I find fascinating about this one is there's a lot of misunderstandings over the terminology and the term and what it means. But what she was trying to say is there's a seat at the table. Software was not as well considered back then, but as we can see, they did some fairly serious work. Her work we'll come back to fault tolerance a little bit later, and one of her design decisions that turns out to have basically saved the mission. But notice there's this idea, there's this parity. There is systems engineering. We're going to take a systems view. There are so many things to coordinate, and software engineering is simply one of them. And this is, what is this systems view? So what does it encompass? So here we have, so the service and command module were developed by Rockwell. And if you just look through all the bits and pieces here, you suddenly realize, if you start counting the number of disciplines, there's a parachute up at the top. That's your classic aerospace. Okay? But the material science here is not classic aerospace. So you're dealing with material science, you're dealing with chemistry, you are dealing with electrical engineering. You've obviously got the software component. When you start running through it, you suddenly think this is incredibly multidisciplinary. It's very easy that we take the encapsulated view of the capsule and just say, yeah, it's just hardware. But actually what they were having to do was to take this huge view and then integrate it with, guess what? It turns out that if you have modules, you can have other companies build them. So this was built by Rockwell, but the Lunar module was, which I think
Grumman.
Was Grumman, yeah. So, and that, I think we have a slide. Well, yeah.
There we go.
So that was built by a separate contractor, but the software, the Apollo guidance computer, was the same. The software running on that. So it turns out that there's a level of communication here that I think we underestimate. But then how big is a system? Turns out the systems can be very, very large. When they were systems thinking, they were systems thinking.
One of the challenges that NASA encountered is first flight, 15 minutes up over Florida, down in the ocean, no problem. Put someone in orbit, they're like, oh, hang on, America's going to be on the wrong side of the Earth for half of this mission. And so they built a global network of tracking stations. Has anyone seen the movie The Dish? It's this movie about the Parkes radio telescope in Australia, which was this massive radio telescope dish in the middle of the outback, which happened to be the dish that was pointing at the moon when Apollo 11 arrived and landed there. And it's a great movie.
It's a lovely movie.
Yeah,
it's definitely
really, really good.
Yeah.
But it also kind of gives you some insight into, they didn't just run everything out of Houston. They had to think about the entire planet as their sort of sphere of operations, no pun intended. And there's this lovely quote, Frank Borman, who was one of the first people to fly around the moon on Apollo 8, first time human beings had ever seen the Earth from deep space. When you're finally up at the moon looking back on Earth, all those differences and nationalistic traits are pretty well going to blend, and you're going to get a concept that maybe this really is one world, and why the hell can't we learn to live together like decent people?
So that's systems thinking.
Bigger picture, it doesn't get much bigger. 4. Standardized. Some people recognize this. I can hear little giggles in the audience. We're going to show you a clip. So the movie Apollo 13, a Ron Howard film made in the 90s about the 13th Apollo mission, which famously ran into all kinds of difficulty. Apollo 13 has been celebrated for its historical accuracy. There's this lovely quote. They asked Jim Lovell, who was the commander, they said, how much of the film did they make up? And he said they got pretty much everything right except the dialogue. They had to invent a little bit of friction and character development, Because if you listen to the transcripts, we weren't arguing, we were just getting on with the mission, you know. But generally, Apollo 13 is celebrated for being as accurate as it could possibly be. And this is a scene from that movie.
Gene, we have a situation brewing with carbon dioxide.
We had a CO2 filter problem on the lunar module.
5 filters on the limb.
Which were meant for 2 guys for a day and a half. So I told the doc,
You're already up to 8 on the gauges. Anything over 15 and you get impaired judgment, blackouts, the beginnings of brain asphyxia.
What about the scrubbers on the command module?
They take square cartridges.
The ones on the limb are round.
Tell me this isn't a government operation.
This just isn't a contingency we've remotely looked at.
Those CO2 levels are going to be getting toxic.
Well, I suggest you gentlemen invent a way to put a square peg in a round hole. Rapidly.
Okay, people, listen up. People upstairs handed us this one, and we gotta come through. We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Better get some coffee going, too, someone.
Now, how many of you worked on a software project that had more than one login server? How many of you worked on a project that had more than one login system? We encounter this idea of, standardization. It crops up time and time again in the way that we work and engineer. I've lost a slide here. Hang on. There we go.
Back. Two back.
Back. There we go. Thank you, PowerPoint. NASA did not use PowerPoint. They used those old-fashioned overhead things with, anyway. The problem they had here, in this scene from Apollo 13, they had to solve a problem. Human beings exhale carbon dioxide, which is toxic. You need a way to remove it from the air that they are breathing. That's the problem. They solved the same problem in 2 different ways because it was solved by 2 different companies building 2 different components of the system. The people building the lunar module solve the problem. We need a way of removing carbon dioxide from air. They used a thing called lithium hydroxide. You run air across it, it absorbs the CO2, you get breathable air back out the other side. Command module, exactly the same problem, same solution, lithium hydroxide. One of them had this big square canister, one had a round canister. Now, what happened with Apollo 13, the main spacecraft was crippled. They had to use the lunar module as a lifeboat. So you had 3 people surviving for about 12 days in a craft that was designed to support 2 people for 3 days. So they ran out of canisters, and they couldn't use the spares because they were the wrong shape because they were built for a different system. Now, this is not about redundancy. They had plenty of canisters. This is about they solved the same problem in 2 different ways. And the reason they did it is probably our old friend Conway's law. Now, a lot of the times on software systems, when you find the same problem has been solved in 2 different ways, you've got 2 different login systems, 2 different ORMs running in different parts of the platform, 2 different data centers or something, it'll be because a team that built one of them, for whatever reason, they couldn't communicate because of politics, because of geographic barriers, just maybe because one team was 5 years ago and the other team was last year. They were not able to communicate, and so they build a system who, as Conway says it, the design of the system is constrained by the communication structures of the organization that created it. Now, in software, this is just a pain in the ass. You've got 2 different login systems, 2 sets of keys to rotate. On Apollo 13, this was very, very nearly, a matter of life and death. And that scene that we just saw, that was actually the inspiration for the show Scrap Heap Challenge. The people behind that show saw this and they had to solve this problem using only a certain, number of components. They had to improvise and stuff. Maybe we could do something similar with that. But, look out for those kind of patterns. If you have to solve a problem, try and come up with a single solution to that problem that you can deploy everywhere that occurs.
And that simplicity is also something else as well, that sometimes even within the same system, even without the assistance of Conway's law, we have a habit of handcrafting complexity without realizing that that was optional. We could have designed against it. And so although not the Apollo program, it's certainly an aerospace lesson, that a good example of this is something like the way that Boeing built their aircraft. Up until the Boeing 777, all the aircraft, all the doors on an aircraft were different shapes. So that basically means one aircraft has multiple different shapes. You have to design, create, and test. They are not interchangeable. And you say, well, that's because the hull is a different shape. You know, the back, it tapers differently and all the rest of it. Yes, but who designed the hull shape? You had control over that. So it turns out that one of the simple innovations of the 777 was let's create it so that we can use the same doors. We have a standard door that will work, and we know it works in all these conditions. There won't be surprise elements. There won't be these edge cases, because we're going to design it so that we can encompass it. Okay, but, you know, as they move towards something that could be standardized, they said, well, rather than could be, it will be. And this is a deeper lesson.
Was it Southwestern Airlines and then Ryanair?
Yeah.
Who took this to the extreme? Every single aircraft that Ryanair fly is the same aircraft. It's a Boeing 737.
Well, actually, it does feel like the same aircraft. It's not very well kitted out, but yeah, but yeah, 737s.
Because that way, every pilot they have on their entire fleet can fly all of their aircraft. All of their ground crew can maintain all of their aircraft, all their technicians. There's no edge cases. It's all the same, you know. It just occurred to me that the phrase snowflake engineering, there's a reason that's not a term that you ever hear. Okay, so the slides thankfully have already counted down to the next item on our list, which is simulation testing.
You've got to test this stuff. Now, how do you test going to the moon? How do you test walking on the moon? How do you test, yes.
Now, NASA were very, very good at coming up with interesting ways of simulating procedures in unfamiliar environments. We have a little montage thanks to NASA's public domain video archives. This is how you rehearse for walking in lunar gravity.
Yeah, lunar gravity is 1/6 of Earth, so therefore you've got to angle this just slightly right, support that, and the effective force is 1/6. Notice, yeah, there you go. There you go. It kind of looks, if you look at the images from the moonwalks, yeah, it's about the same kind of dynamic, although it's somewhat more elegant.
So this was an aircraft called a KC-135. They call it the Vomit Comet. And it flies these big parabolic dives, so you get about 30, 40 seconds of free fall. And every single thing, they tested food in free fall to make sure that the crumbs didn't drift away. They tested the drinks containers, they tested the toilets, every detail that was going to fly in zero gravity. For EVA's extravehicular activity, spacewalks, they tested it in huge water tanks. They would literally build replicas of the spacecraft and the systems underwater. They'd go down there in a spacesuit. If you look for these, by the way, you find so many clips on YouTube of people going, NASA faked the moon landings, look, you can see the bubbles. And you're like, no.
But there's a really important point here with a lot of this stuff, is that you're seeing, and this is a point that we should be able to take into our workplace, testing requires creativity. Okay, there's this idea of like, you want everything, you know, how do I test this? It's impossible to test, so we won't test it. Well, no, it's not impossible. It's just perhaps it's not a technique that you've thought of. It's perhaps not something that you've come across. And, you know, that standard mocking framework that you're using perhaps didn't think about the special case that you're working with. Be creative. Good testing requires creativity. And there's a certain delight in some of that. There are actually pictures of the astronauts, the Apollo astronauts sitting in the pool, just, you know, practicing being, you know, we've done the main practice, they're just lying there in the sun.
Let's practice doing nothing in space.
Yeah, and that actually, that is a skill. This is the flying bedstead, which was used for the lunar landing, and they went through more than one. Neil Armstrong was very lucky to survive a crash with one, but it was, there's a notion here of getting the sense of what is it actually like to fly this, and trying to get as close as possible. As we say, ingenuity is necessary.
Yeah. One of the fascinating things about their approach to simulation, so you think about, you know, software system where you've got all these complexities, you've got usability, you've got accessibility, you've got performance, you've got scalability. And we often think of, you know, the idea of having a staging environment or something. Think about it with a NASA perspective. Can you create an environment where you're not too worried about usability and stuff? What you're doing is you're testing how your application scales. How many of you have got a primary key that's in an integer column in one of your databases? Come on, it's a software conference. This is everybody. What are you going to do if you get 32 billion customers? Is it going to overflow? Will it overflow, or will it just wrap around and come out negative? And what is your code going to do if it gets a customer with a customer ID of minus 32 billion? You know, these are all edge cases which are very, very hard to test as part of an integrated test suite, but it's very, very easy to just spin up a copy of the code, 3, 2, increment, whoa. I didn't know it was going to do that.
So if anybody needs to make a phone call at this point, or just
If anyone's like
message
on
where-
31 billion and something, just you can excuse you for a few minutes. So, all right, we are nearly at liftoff.
Yeah.
2.
So this is an interesting one. No matter how hard you test, no matter how creative you are in trying to explore the scenarios, there is always something that will come up that will surprise you. And one of the classics is the 1202 era.
So there's 2 kinds of space nerds. There's people who like rockets, and there's people who know what a 1202 alarm is. What's a 1202 alarm, Kevlin?
Right, well, these two, this goes right back to Margaret Hamilton. It goes back to the executive for the AGC software, the Apollo Guidance Computer Software. The spec of that hardware was minimal. If you're landing, you need to do a lot. You've got a single core, almost no memory, and there are multiple tasks. So basically it kind of goes around. It has a very simple kind of scheduling model. But what if it becomes overloaded? Now, they designed it to not become overloaded, but what if it does? Yeah, but ever said that? Oh, it's okay, this will never happen.
That'll never happen.
That'll never happen, yeah, but what if it does? This is the code that Margaret Hamilton was ultimately responsible for. What they did was they had a way of dropping low priority tasks. And they also had a way that it would self-reboot and do it fast in a way that would clear all the unnecessary tasks, but still retain navigation information. Because as you know, normally a reboot doesn't do that. It kind of clears everything. So therefore, it could be a fast reboot. In other words, it's okay to reboot in flight, which is if somebody told you that your aircraft was going to reboot whilst it was flying and you were on it, you'd normally be quite, So this was built. This was built to do this. Now, one of the things that they had, and it turns out it's 1201 and 1202. Those 2 error codes, both, notice start, executive overflow. The 1202, I think, happened 4 times. The 1201 happened once. It was on the descent. Now, one of the things they did during descent is they just checked the rendezvous radar, because when they come back up, then they need the radar to find the command module. So they just checked it. While we're going down, let's just check. Standard routine thing that they're going to do. And it's not actually necessary when you're landing. You don't need it, but it's a check as you're going in. Now, it turns out one of the things they hadn't anticipated was a little bit of incompatibility in the power supplies. And it turns out the power supply was causing spurious signals that were being interpreted as tasks that started overloading the executive. And this is what happened. The 1202 error was basically, this was the system identifying there as a problem and ditching its load, restarting as necessary. They saw a pattern too. I think it was Aldrin who actually recognized the pattern. It's like, wait a minute, this is coming up.
You hear on the and it's this whole thing. We got a 1202 alarm, go or no go. They are seconds away. They're gliding across the lunar surface. Armstrong's looking for somewhere to land because the place they were supposed to land turned out to be covered in boulders. So he's trying to find a spot to touch down. They got this 1202 alarm, and they're like,
oh, and they're running out of fuel.
Just to keep it chill. Neil Armstrong's heart rate on that got up to something like 82, didn't it? And they looked at the telemetry. They're like,
this cool as a cucumber. Yeah. That's hiring the right people.
Yeah, mission control, 1202 alarm, go or no go. And they're like, Eagle hold, we're looking into that. And a minute later, they're like, 1202 alarm again. And mission control by this point have got the people who wrote the manual. And they're like, what do we do with the 1202 alarm? They're like, it's going to be fine. It just means the computer's dumping its instructions and resetting. As long as they have control, they're all right. You are go. They land, they make history.
Now, you're looking at that going like, well, that's not one of the standard photographs I've ever seen. This is honestly the best resolution we could find. But this is an unexpected.
38 seconds after launch, with the Saturn V engines burning 15 tons of fuel a second, Apollo 12 got struck by lightning twice. And the entire spacecraft basically stops responding. Every warning light on the panel lights up. All of the instruments go dead. The rockets are still firing because it's quite hard to switch them off once they got going. So it is still climbing. And, they're like, this is Apollo, Houston, we have a problem. Basically, everything has suddenly stopped working. And there was a guy called John Aaron who had worked on the electrical systems that were flying on this, who was what's called the ECOM, the Environment, Electrical, and Communications Director. He's in the flight deck, and he's like, okay, we have never rehearsed for a lightning strike, but we have seen this telemetry pattern before. We've had one thing in one of our training exercises where the people who ran the simulations, who were sadists, went, switch off all the instruments and see how they do with it. And so he had the kind of presence of mind to be like, all right, we don't know what's caused this, looks like a lightning strike, but let's try to switching the main power to a thing called SCE, to auxiliary. So he said SCE to auxiliary. Flight director doesn't know what that is. Relays the instruction. They relay this up to the ship. One of the crew, Alan Bean, who's the lunar module pilot, is like, yeah, I remember that because it was in one of the simulations. Flicks the switch. It makes it to orbit. They go into orbit around the Earth. They do a full checkout. They're like, yep, you know what? We got struck by lightning twice, but we're okay. We're going to go to the moon anyway. And you know what they did when they got to the moon? They played golf. Pete Conrad, he had a surveying rod, and he got someone to make him a little putter because they want to see how far you could drive a golf ball on the moon.
And just as an interesting point, Pete Conrad would have been, had the 1202 error not worked out in favour, they would have aborted the mission, and Pete Conrad would have been the first man to set foot on the moon.
So we're almost out of time.
But we're almost there.
But we're almost done.
The level of dealing with the unexpected went as far as this. This memo basically deals with what would have happened. So you can see the date, July 18th. The landing was the 20th. They launched on the 16th. In the event of the disaster, here's the speech that Nixon would deliver. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. And these brave men, Neil Armstrong and Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery, but they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. And one of the most interesting things is actually that lovely closing sentence right at the end. They will be mourned by a Mother Earth that dared send two of her sons into the unknown, which is kind of lovely. The speech goes on, but it's less exciting after that.
This was one of, so this was the speech in the event that they landed but couldn't get back off. So this was the speech if they ended up with these two astronauts alive on the surface of the moon with no hope of recovery. They had a speech for what would happen if it exploded. They had a speech for what would happen if it crashed, you know. Expecting the unexpected, all of these things they had. I mean, they hadn't done a huge amount of prep because they were like, oh, well, they're halfway to the moon and we should probably come up with something just in case, you know.
So, CAPCOM. That's Charlie Duke on the left. I referred to him earlier on. Mentioning that Aldrin and Armstrong had primed him that they were going to use the term Tranquility Base. Charlie Duke, he was Apollo 16, but CAPCOM is a very particular role, very special role.
Yeah, the CAPCOM, it comes from the phrase capsule communicator. And they realized very early on that within mission control, there are 30 or 40 people, all of whom are constantly, they have their own telemetry, they have updates, they have advice, they have questions. Can you check this? Ask them to look at this, ask them to do that. To minimize the risk of confusion or conflicting orders, they nominate one person, CAPCOM, the capsule communicator. That is the person who talks to the astronauts. You want to talk to the astronauts? You tell them. They will either relay the message or they will patch them through to you. You can talk to them directly.
They are Houston. They are mission control. From the
Houston, we've had a problem. This is who Houston is. This is who they are talking to. And you know, that's a lesson that applies in all sorts of engineering situations. You ever get into work and you've got 5 different people telling you 5 different things that are most important? Fix this bug, ignore the bug, fix this, run that report, ship these designs, don't ship those designs. Move the button this way, no, move the button that way. CAPCOM is basically like, you know, a really, really good product owner. They take the input from all the stakeholders and they make sure that the implementation team are getting one series of decisions that are not being undermined and not being challenged. They control the channel of communication between the stakeholders and between the people who are actually responsible for fulfilling the objectives.
So there's a single voice, but also there's something else about this one. It's not just enough to have a single voice. That single voice has to be competent and trusted. Okay, in other words, it's no good just simply the way that many organizations do. It's like, we're going to nominate a product owner. Have you ever been a product owner before? No, I was something completely different. But suddenly you've parachuted in, you're a product owner. That doesn't mean that you won't do a good job, but perhaps you're not necessarily competent. But also one of the biggest problems that people have, and I get this a lot, is just, well, how do we control our product owner? How do we do this? Product owner, trust. This is a really simple case. And if we look, here's somebody who trained with the people he's communicating with. He is an astronaut. He's going to set foot on the moon. In other words, it's not just that he's competent, understands the language and understands everything else. He is trusted implicitly already. So, in other words, CAPCOM is not just something you get randomly. It's not get randomly assigned. There is definitely a precondition to that.
And so, finally,
liftoff. Our 11th item. It's the user journey that matters.
Now, we've talked at length about spacecraft with names like Apollo and Gemini and Mercury and Lunar Excursion Modules and 1969 CO-105 or whatever it was. The story that people remember is not Apollo or Mercury or Gemini. It is Neil Armstrong, a human being walking on the surface of the moon. When we create technological solutions, what we are trying to do is we are trying to fulfill a human objective. We're trying to help somebody do something. The technology on its own is not, it doesn't solve any problems until you put it in the hands of a person and you say, here, you can use this tool, this product, this framework, this compiler, whatever it is that we're creating. You can use this, and when we get it right, they take the things that we have created, and the outcome of that is a compelling story. It's a brilliant product pitch, it's people talking with their friends over drinks at a conference like this. Oh, I used WebStorm and it was amazing and it was brilliant and it fixed this, or Visual Studio Code was fantastic, or have you seen this thing that's coming out? There's another, while I was putting this together, I realized another anniversary, aerospace anniversary we have this year. Yes. 1969 was also the first flight of Concorde. And, aviation geeks are like, Concorde, yay, supersonic jetliner. But the story that Concorde sold was you can leave home in New York in the morning, have meetings in London, and be home in time for bed. That was it. So the people who flew once, it was the supersonic flight of a lifetime, no expense spared, champagne, Mark II, break the sound barrier, tell your grandkids about it. To the people who flew it a lot, and they existed, they were, Concorde was about, what, $10,000, $15,000 a ticket in today's prices? But for them, the story was nothing to do with the sound barrier. The story was about wake up in America, meetings in London, home in time to, put your kids to bed. That was the compelling story. And so often when, people, you look at the advertising campaigns of companies now like Apple and Samsung, they're not talking about megahertz and processors and this. They're showing happy people doing things. They're trying to tell you human stories, user journeys. That's what they're sharing. It doesn't matter whether you're building software tools or websites or you're trying to take somebody to the moon and back. It is the user journey that matters. If you lose sight of that, you just end up with technology. And the only time anyone remembers the technology, hands up who can name a nuclear power station. Is it Chernobyl? We remember technology, when it fails, We want what we do to be part of these compelling narratives, these maybe historic, maybe just happy people at the end of the day.
So we're going to deliver a footprint. That's, you have to just make that a little more exciting. But ultimately, that is one of the things that's one of the things. That's all of that technology is, because you suddenly realize that is somebody's footprint on another world.
50 years ago, that's still there. 500,000 people, $40 billion, some of the most advanced, risky cutting-edge aviation engineering ever. The spacecraft are in museums or burned up on re-entry or somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. The footprint, the human footprint is still there.
The flag is white because it turns out the flags bleach in direct sunlight like that. So the concept of nation has disappeared. We have a human foot. That's what we get.
And a white flag of surrender. So let's splash down. Let's just recap. Strategy, vision, roadmap. Make decisions. Communicate them. Follow through on them. Reinforce them. Be prepared to revisit your own decisions, but if you're inspiring people to follow your lead, have a vision and stick to it.
Get the right people. It's a case of there is motivation. You want people who have the motivation to work this. And it's not always the stars. It's too easy to be distracted by the stars and the obvious roles. It is everybody.
Approaches and decisions. Consider the alternatives. There will be ways of solving the thing you're trying to do, which at first sight you think, we're not using PHP. Don't be ridiculous. We're not doing that. Give them due consideration. At that early stage, you cast that net wide open. When you pick an approach, go with it. Decisions are necessary, otherwise analysis paralysis, you will make no progress.
Follow through. Identify the milestones, identify the risks. Demonstrate each risk intentionally and in turn, not just theoretically, deliver on it. Actually have something that empirically demonstrates it.
Naming things matters. Snoopy, Gumdrop, Charlie Brown, Word, Excel, other common English words that are ungoogleable. I saw Scott Hanselman giving a talk last night where he talked about Microsoft calling a framework .NET and how nowadays they would never do anything that stupid like calling an editor code, and how, naming things matters. Names are how we develop a sense of attachment and ownership to the systems and the products that we build and we maintain.
Take the systems view. It's really easy to just focus in on the bit that you're good at, your discipline, your favorite thing, your favorite tool. It's part of something far, far larger. And that also relates to the people connection, but it's important you need to understand that work in context.
Standardization. Don't solve the same problem twice. Solve the problem once, duplicate the solution. Know that your backups are going to work. If you have two of something, test them both, but they should do the same thing. Same solution, two different places. Do not end up with square pegs and round holes.
And test. And that means test everything, test creatively. Sometimes you need to simulate the world that you are actually going to deploy into. Sometimes it's not easy to say, well, what is it like with millions of users simultaneously? Well, create something, get creative. It's not standard, doesn't matter, create it.
What's the software equivalent of hanging someone sideways and making them run down a piece of plywood?
Yeah.
That's what got us to the moon. Expect the unexpected. Have plans, even stuff that is not on your golden path, stuff that is not going to happen. Test for the negatives. The old joke where a software engineer is testing a bar, and they're like 1 beer, 2 beers, soft drink, yeah, we're good to go. And a QA engineer is like 1 beer, 2 beers, 1,000,000 beers, -5 beers, a lizard. The bar is ready to go. They open the bar, customer walks in, says, where's the toilet? And the bar explodes. Anticipate things which are not part of your plan. If someone can find a way to mess with your system, they will.
One voice. Got to be a trusted voice. You need this, whether this person is architect, product owner, customer representative, whatever it is, they have to have that idea that whatever the confusion that happens on the other side, the confusion in the customer, the confusion in the organization, whatever it is, there is one voice you can trust, and you listen to them.
Liftoff. It's the user journey that matters. Whatever we're doing, we're helping people get somewhere. Somewhere physical, somewhere technical, somewhere metaphorical. And if we do it right, they're going to tell people the story with a smile on their face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.